Three. And good afternoon, producer Susan. How are you doing today? Did you get buried in this big snowstorm, the blizzard?
Sadly, no. We were supposed to get 8 inches and we only got 2 inches.
Well, we got, depending where you were at, two to four, and the whole state shut down. Schools were closed, you know.
We were on a 2 hour delay because it didn't start snow until 5 a.m. But
And you got
it
3 inches, and they closed it 2 hour delay for 3 inches of snow. Oh my goodness.
it was only because of the timing of when it started. They had to get things plowed. But
Early
yeah,
morning. All right. All right. Well, maybe you'll get the big one before the end of before the end of the season. You still got a couple of weeks to go.
yeah,
Remember in Colorado, we used to get a big one every April. So who knows?
yeah.
And
Usually spring, March, the first or
yeah,
second week in March, we usually get a big storm.
March are big ones. All right. Anyway, you want to hear what we got to talk about today?
Yeah, what's on the agenda?
Well, we're going to go back to our old friend Thomas Sowell, who's going to give us a comment on the difference on statistics and the difference between correlation and causation, which a lot of people confuse. In another sad example of the mental decline of President Biden, we'll play a clip of him confusing the country of Egypt with the country of Mexico. Last week, we played him a clip of him claiming he talked to two different dead people in the same week, and this week he's confusing countries. In a story I teased last week and never got to, we'll tell you why the construction of new wind turbines is responsible for massive increases in CO2 emissions. I teased it and never got to it. We ran out of time. And we'll tell you in which U.S. city the number of 911 calls per year averages more than 2 calls per every citizen. So in the town you live in, what percentage of the people you think make a 911 call in a year?
Oh, 10%.
Can you imagine living in a city where everybody in the city calls 911 an average of 2 times a year? Every 6 months, you're calling 911.
That's crazy.
Great. We'll tell you where that city is. We'll tell you where thieves are stealing EV charging cables and how much it's costing one city to replace them. We'll tell you which city's 70 building inspectors were arrested for accepting bribes and why that practice was one of that city's worst kept secrets for decades. 70 virtually every building inspector in the city was arrested for taking bribes. And it's been the worst kept secret of that city. And we'll tell you who finally stepped in and arrested him. Now, we've all heard about AI system, artificial intelligence. I think a year ago, we were the very first to talk about AI systems like Chat GPT, right? Well, now
Yep.
it turns out that they're using AI systems are consuming enormous amounts of electric power, incredible amounts. And we'll tell you how much, and how much power that CO2 is generating, because and we'll tell you why it's dirty power, not clean power. And we'll tell you about a decision last week by Hawaii's Supreme Court that's based on the claim that the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court rulings don't apply to the state of Hawaii. Can you imagine a state saying, no, the U.S. Constitution and your rulings don't apply to us? That was the basis for a ruling they issued last week. I guess they never read the Constitution. There's something called the Supremacy Clause that said the U.S. Constitution takes precedent over everything else. And last but not least, I think was it last week we had a taxpayer relief shot from a very old woman, or was
Mhm.
it the week before, living out by herself someplace?
Yeah, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, but yes, recently.
Well, we have another one. A 67-year-old woman
Mm.
home alone at 3 o'clock in the morning, and some guy breaks down her door. Anyway, so you want to roll right into this? Or you got any comments
Yeah.
before we start?
Nope.
All right. So our old friend Thomas Sowell, he said one of the first things taught in introductory statistics textbooks is that correlation is not causation. It's
Mhm.
also one of the first things forgotten. And people say, well, if you look at the correlation between X and Y, people say, well, if you look at the correlation between the assault weapon bans and the decline and the rise in mass shootings after it expired, there's proof that it worked. No,
Mhm.
that's a correlation. It's not causation. And let me give an example of correlation. I could prove to you that 98% of heroin addicts drank cow's milk before the age of 3. That's a correlation, is it not?
Yes, it is.
But does that mean that drinking cow's milk before the age of 3 is a causal factor leading to heroin addiction?
No.
No. So just because two things happened at the same time does not mean, again, the first rule of statistics, correlation is not causation. So you can't
Mhm.
say just because two things happened at the same time, there was a causal link. Now, if there is a correlation, you can go looking for a causal link. But in the case of the assault weapons ban, just as one of 100 examples, there
Mhm.
is no actual causal link. And you can point to a lot of things. By the way, the 100% increase in mass shootings after the so-called assault weapons ban expired in 1994, 90% of the increase were done with handguns, which were never covered,
Mhm.
by the assault weapons ban to begin with. So to say that it was the expiration of the assault weapons ban, which only covered big, scary AR-15 type rifles,
Mhm.
was responsible for the rise in mass shootings in the following decade, when 90% of those mass shootings were caused by handguns, is nonsense. Though there is no causal link between the two, even though there's correlation.
Mhm.
So any comments on correlation and causation?
No, but you're right. Those are two terms that I think people mix up daily.
Yeah, and and it's natural to assume that if two things correlate, that there must be a causal link. But no, just
Mhm.
because something correlates doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal link. You always have to look for the causal link. And it's one of the most misunderstood things in statistics. All right. Last week, we talked about Biden, claiming he talked to people who died 20 years earlier. Now, this week, if you've been living under a rock, the Department of Justice released their report on the investigation. Remember, Biden had classified documents in a cardboard box in his
Mhm.
garage,
Yep.
and he had classified documents in a closet in a shared in a public office building.
Yep.
Um, so they were investigated because those were violations of the U.S. Code of Criminal Justice. So they assigned a special prosecutor, and the special prosecutor, by the way, found that he did in fact break the law. He broke several laws. But however, he recommended no prosecution based on Biden's failing memory, which he came out and said he would be perceived as an elderly gentleman with a failing memory, couldn't remember when he was vice president, couldn't remember the year his son died. Anyway, that Biden got angry, and in an impromptu rebuttal speech, he came out and he wanted to rebut this Department of Justice report saying that he had a failing memory. Well, he actually made a bad situation worse, because he comes out to give this speech to prove to people that his memory is not failing. And listen to this speech where he's talking about a conversation he had with the president of Israel and Egypt about opening the Rafah Gate, which is the gate between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And this is supposed to be between Israel and here we go.
Conduct of the response in the Gaza Strip has been over the top. I think that, as you know, initially, President of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humans.
You just said the president of Mexico, Sisi. Now,
Yeah.
Sisi is the president of Egypt. By the way, I'm going to back this up. Listen to all the pauses as he struggles. He starts sentences, and then
Mhm.
then he doesn't finish. He starts a different sentence. I want you to listen very carefully to the pauses and the sentence structure where he starts a sentence and doesn't finish it.
The conduct of the response in the Gaza Strip has been over the top. I think that,
Long pause, long pause.
as you know,
Mid change started one sentence, jump to a different sentence. I'm going to play that again.
as you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi,
The president of Mexico, Sisi. No, it's Sisi's the president of Egypt.
did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate. I talked to Bibi to open the gate on the Israeli side.
So what do you think? I mean, It's one
Yeah,
thing if,
and you had mentioned this at the beginning of this about, when asked about when his son had died, that he didn't remember the date and then got very angry about it. I mean, that type of reaction is sadly typical of people who of his age who are losing their memory, that they become very angry because maybe they don't have the answer. And I don't know if they're angry at the person asking or angry at themselves because they don't have the answers.
well, he directed his anger at the special prosecutor for stating that he couldn't remember when he was vice president. He couldn't remember the year his son died. So he was
And I think
angry
as a
that this.
parent, that's not a date that you ever forget unless you are, in mental
Right.
decline.
So anyway, so the special prosecutor, documented and said, and because of this, he would come across as a sympathetic elderly gentleman who's losing his memory, and therefore I don't think any jury would, convict a man of his age with his, failing. And he got all indignant that, somebody said, well, he's an elderly man with a failing memory. So he came out to give that speech to show the world that no, I'm just as sharp as a tack. And what does he proceed to do? He confuses the president of Egypt with Mexico. Of
I'm
course,
curious
Mexico.
now that we're 8 months out from the election, if the DNC is going to announce another candidate.
Well, they could, but as long as he doesn't withdraw, that would be disastrous, because if he doesn't withdraw, then you've got a split, vote. So, in order for the DNC to do that, he would actually have to withdraw. Otherwise, it would just be the death knell. But if he stays in, as bad of a candidate as Trump is, if he stays in, I think that guarantees a Trump reelection. The only hope for the Democrats is for Biden to withdraw and for them to nominate a sharp, charismatic, whether it be Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, out of Michigan. But if Biden is the nominee in November, the Democrats don't stand a chance, because Biden is not going to get any sharper between now and November. So it's just going to be good. All right. Let's move on to how now wind turbines are supposed to reduce CO2 emissions, right?
Supposedly.
Supposedly, no. You've probably never been up close to a wind turbine, have you?
I actually have.
To an actual one that's been installed upright?
Yep.
Now, the base of the wind turbine that you saw was probably a square pad that was maybe 10, 20 yards square.
Yeah, that's about right.
Do you know that under the dirt in 50 yards in every direction, there's a massive substructure to keep the thing from tipping over?
Mhm.
Did you know that?
Yeah, I did know that actually.
Yeah. And there's pictures. You can go look at, wind turbine foundation. In order to keep a wind turbine from tipping over when the wind blows, you have to have this massive structure that runs out 50 yards in every direction. And it's rebar covered with 566 metric ton, cubic meters. Um, 257 cubic meters of cement, which is almost 600 tons of cement. Now, let me read you something from the U.S. Energy Administration. Although the cement industry uses only 0.25% of total U.S. energy, it is the most energy intensive of all manufacturing industries, with a share of national energy use roughly 10 times its share of gross output in goods and services. Concrete, the production of concrete is the third largest CO2 emitter in the world, accounting for up to 8% of the world's CO2. So here you have concrete, which is the single biggest of any product you could pick: steel, copper, wood. Concrete is responsible for up to 8% of the world's CO2. And a typical wind tunnel, just one wind turbine, uses 566 tons of concrete. So if the goal is to reduce CO2 emissions, why are we building new wind turbines at such a frantic pace? And there's a video, and producer Susan, maybe you can put this video up that will show this foundation that's covered over with dirt that people never see. So can you put this up?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All
And
right.
interesting, what was in Las Vegas before the Super Bowl was the National World of Concrete Conference
Okay.
was being hosted in Vegas, and it was interesting. The president of the conference or whatever, he said that the world's largest commodity is concrete, but second largest is concrete, second to water. But what's the main ingredient in concrete is
Water, well, sand and limestone, sand and water and
and
rock.
water. So yeah,
Okay.
it's second to water.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about you want to talk about 911 calls?
Yeah.
Well, first let's talk about the state that has the highest number of 911 calls. Um, so in Pennsylvania, what do you think now I realize in places like Pittsburgh and particularly Philadelphia, it's probably pretty
Yep.
high.
Yep.
But as a state, Harrisburg, State College, Allentown, what do you think the ratio of 911 calls to people is?
I'll say 10%.
10%. Now you're probably right. Well, let's go to New Mexico, which has become a real crap hole. In New Mexico, they're averaging 1,169 911 calls per thousand
Wow.
residents. That's more than one call per resident per year. And
Wow.
and you think that's high? Washington, D.C., which has 3 carjackings a day. Remember last month we talked
Yeah.
about the number of 3 car. Washington, D.C. leads the pack with 2,012 calls per 1,000 population.
Wow.
That is more than 2 calls per person per year.
Oh.
Is that just mind blowing?
Now, look, especially when you consider, okay, New Mexico is such a desolate state. I mean, other than like maybe Santa Fe,
Right.
I, I can't imagine there's a whole lot of crime in New Mexico
Yeah.
as a populace. But DC, as we know, is such a small area. What is it, 7 square miles?
Yeah.
6 square
Something. Yeah.
miles?
Well, it's like,
Yeah.
no, it's not. I think it might be 12. I think it's like 3.5 miles on the side, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and now they get some visitors. I'm sure tourists come in and have to call 911. They get mugged or something.
Yeah.
But still, 2,000 calls per thousand residents and 3 carjackings a day is just mind blowing. And of course, it's been a Democrat-run city forever. All right. So you probably don't know this, but 30 years ago, I used to work in Manhattan, and it was common knowledge in Manhattan. And you want to get anything done, you had to pay off the inspectors, you had to pay off the cops. Like if you were working in a building and you had a commercial like a service van and you wanted to park it next to the building and you wanted to leave it there all day, you had to slip the cop $100. And he would leave you alone. Otherwise, he'd give you 1 ticket every hour.
Mhm.
And contractors that worked in apartment buildings, they knew if you wanted to get any work awarded to you, you had to bribe well, let me back up. New York City has something called public housing, and this is and they have more than 100 apartment buildings where they house people on welfare. These people who can't pay rent, or they pay little to no rent, or they get a Section 8 housing allowance, and it's called NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. And they have 70 housing inspectors, and each housing inspector is responsible for a couple of buildings. And when people have a problem, they say, "Oh, I've got no water," or the fuses blew out, or the lights are no good, or the toilets, the sink fell off the wall. They're responsible for um, assigning a contractor to do the repair. And under the New York City regulations, if the repair is under $10,000, they have the ability to just award it. No bid, no nothing. Hey, Frank, Frank's Plumbing and Heating, get over here. I want you to replace this furnace. And of course, ramp it. So I knew this 30 years ago. Everybody who works in the city knew it was corrupt. Well, finally, last week, the U.S. Department, not the New York City District Attorney, the Federal Department of Justice did a raid. They arrested 70, which is virtually every single building inspector in New York City, and charged them all with bribery. And this wasn't just, one time. This was a way of life. And the bribery was not always cash. Sometimes these guys were giving expensive watches. Sometimes they were given expense paid cruises, for they and their wives. And, so it wasn't always cash, but it was rampant. Now, I don't know if you ever saw this. You ever see the firm film Casablanca with Humphrey?
Yes.
At the
Yep.
end of the scene, Captain Renault, the captain there, who was always a patron of Rick's club. Rick, Humphrey was Rick. He said, "I'm shocked to find out that gambling has been going on here." As the guy hands him his chips, "You're winning, sir." Anyway, so this was, I'm shocked. Well, I'm shocked, and it's not surprising that it took the U.S. Department of Justice to finally take action to stop a practice in the city and county of New York, including which, by the way, who's the district attorney in New York City? I'll give you a hint. His first name is Alvin.
Oh, I forget his name.
Alvin Bragg.
Yeah.
It should have been Alvin Bragg clamping down on this, but it's just been a practice for decades, that if you wanted to work in a city building, you had to pay off the inspector. Anyway, so you probably didn't hear that in the news in Pennsylvania, did you?
Nope, did not.
So we call this the Jersey Joe News in Perspective. You won't hear on TV. Well, that's something. If you don't live in and around New York, you didn't hear that virtually every building inspector in New York City was arrested by the U.S. Department of Justice last week. All right, you want to move on to some more crime?
Yeah.
Now,
It's sad that these are our topics though, too.
all right. You've seen an EV charging station, right?
Yes.
You got a big 12-foot, 15-foot long cable. You know what's inside that cable?
Copper.
Copper. So what do you think? And if you're a thief with a pair of big snips or a bolt cutter, how long do you think it takes you to cut that cord off?
About 2 seconds.
2 seconds. You know what the price of copper is these days?
Oh, what, $6 a pound?
$3 a pound.
Oh,
So
$3,
maybe you're going to
okay.
get 10 or 12 bucks out of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is all over the country, but I have the data from Minneapolis, which is a medium-sized city.
Mhm.
In the past 6 months, Minneapolis has had to replace the cables on 44 public EV charging stations, and they still have 20 more left to go for a total of 64. Do you know what it's costing them to replace each charging cable?
Oh, I'm sure it's probably thousands of dollars.
$4,000 a piece.
Yeah.
So 64 times 4, that's $250,000. So the crooks are getting 10, 12 bucks a cable, and it's costing the city $4,000.
And at what point does the city say we're not doing this anymore?
If it was a city, I would have said, screw it, we're not fixing them anymore. I would have made it I would have made it private. I would have put them maybe in a compound where you had to go in, like when you go into a self-storage place, you have to punch in a code or put your credit
Yeah.
card in, and they're in a secure compound. So yeah, so they'd be in the middle of the city, but you would have to, you'd have to punch in a key, you'd
Mhm.
punch in a code, or ever go to a car wash, you put your credit card in,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
read your, and then the arm lifts up.
Yeah.
If private industry was doing that, I guarantee you they wouldn't just be replacing. And that's what I think I mentioned. They've had to replace some of these cables more than once. So they'll replace them, and 2 days later they've been cut again. So, and they're in producer Susan, I've got a video of that news report too, if you want to post that one.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, you've heard of the supremacy clause, right? In the US Constitution?
Yes.
And the US Constitution says, hey, state, if you want to incorporate, you can put anything you want, but you are always subordinate to the US Constitution. There's a supremacy clause, which says if anything you put in your Constitution that conflicts with our Constitution is unconstitutional, and it's in void. Anyway, so some guy in Hawaii, he was new to the city, he moved in, he came in, I don't know how he got there, flew in, he rented an apartment, he was living there. And I think he was in some state park, and he had a gun. Well, in Hawaii, you have to register guns. You have to register your guns, which you didn't know you had to do it. Anyway, so they arrested the guy, he had a trial, and his defense attorney said, under the US Constitution, my client has a right to keep and bear arms. And the lower court in Hawaii said, yep, you're right. And the law and the charge that he was not able to have a gun, we agree with you, and they found him not guilty. Well, the prosecutor appealed that decision, and the state Supreme Court then said, we don't really care about the Bruin decision. There, in the Hawaii Constitution, there is no right to keep and bear arms. Therefore, we are overturning the lower court's decision, and we're reinstating the guilty verdict, and we're finding this guy guilty of violating the state's law. So and let me quote, oh, by the way, you ever see the TV APS show, The Wire?
No, I don't think I
Well, there,
have.
anyway, in their decision, and this is all, this is, if this wasn't so sad, it would almost be comical. In their judicial opinion, their written opinion, they actually quoted a phrase from a TV show, which was the AP The Wire. And in their written opinion on this case, here's the quote they took from that show. The thing about the old days, they were the old days, meaning that was then, this is now. And then they go on, Article 1, Section 17 of the Hawaii Constitution mirrors the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. However, we read those words differently than the current United States Supreme Court. We hold that in Hawaii, there is no state constitutional right to carry a firearm in public. The spirit of aloha clashes with a federally mandated lifestyle that lets citizens walk around with deadly weapons during day-to-day activities. The history of the Hawaiian Islands does not include a society where armed people move about the community to possibly combat the deadly aims of others. But so listen to I'm going to read that first sentence again. We read those words differently than the current United States Supreme Court. We hold that in Hawaii, there is no state constitutional right to carry a firearm in public. Well, it doesn't matter if it doesn't exist in Hawaii. It exists at the federal level.
Yep.
So whether you have it, so whether it's absent from your Constitution, doesn't mean it disappears from the U.S. Constitution. Anyway, I'm figuring that one won't ever make it to the Supreme Court because I'm guessing the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, as liberal as it is going to tell those idiots that you cannot claim that your state constitution takes precedence over the U.S. Constitution. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I hope that this guy takes appeals and goes to the Supreme
Oh,
Court.
it absolutely is being, well, it's being appealed, but it's going to be, it's being appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, which would
Mhm.
be the, and I guarantee the first federal, I can't believe the Ninth Circuit is not going to overrule that.
Mhm.
Anyway, how much time we got left?
You got about 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes.
All right, so let's talk about why we call them taxpayer relief shots. So let me bring up my buddy from the Santa Rosa County, Florida, and here's what he thinks about it. Here we go.
If somebody's breaking in your house, you're more than welcome to shoot them in Santa Rosa County. We prefer that you do, actually. Hopefully, you'll save the taxpayers money.
And then, of course, we've got our old buddy Grady Judge, Sheriff Grady Judge from Polk County.
But we have received information in social media that some of the criminals were going to take their criminal conduct into the neighborhoods. I would tell them, if you value your life, you probably shouldn't do that in Polk County, because the people of Polk County like guns. They have guns. I encourage them to own guns, and they're going to be in their homes tonight with their guns loaded. And if you try to break into their homes to steal, to set fires, I'm highly recommending they blow you back out of the house with their guns.
And let me tell you how appropriate that is, because the taxpayer relief shot we're going to play tonight is from a woman who lives in Florida. And this thug comes into her home at 3 o'clock in the morning while she's there alone. And she apparently took Sheriff Judd's advice. And here's a report of this woman in Florida, 67 years old, by herself.
A Putnam County woman shot him for breaking into her home. That man is 64-year-old Reginald Best. Someone, the 67-year-old homeowner, did not know. The homeowner told police she was in fear for her life when she killed Best.
Within the hour, we've learned the woman will not face any criminal charges for this shooting. Her home is in Interlochen, about 90 miles southwest of Jacksonville. News4Jax reporter Eric Avanier is there. Eric, we know the Putnam County Sheriff's Office not only investigated at the scene of the shooting, but also at the home of the man who was killed.
Yeah, and that home is right behind me here off of Silver Lake Drive. This is the home that Best had been renting. Deputies were called here 3 times between late last night and this morning. Best called 911 late last night to report unknown people breaking into his home while he was outside. Deputies arrived, and there were no signs of any burglary, and they could not find Best. Hours later, Best called 911 again to report unknown people, but this time he says that they were wearing all orange clothing and they were outside his home while he was sheltered in place. Deputies arrived, and again, Best was nowhere to be found. Then hours later, a third call came in. This time, a woman who was inside the home told 911 dispatchers that Best had just jumped out of a window and took off running down the street with a gun in his hand. Just as deputies were arriving at the home, they got a call from a 67-year-old homeowner nearby about a shooting. We are not identifying the homeowner because she has not been charged in the shooting, and she is also considered a victim. The woman told deputies she first heard a front door handle shaking. She said she grabbed her 9mm handgun and opened the door. She said that's when an unknown man, later identified as Reginald Best, forced his way into the home. The woman told investigators that she ordered Best to leave multiple times and feared for her life. Then she said she shot him. Best was taken to the hospital where he later died. Sheriff Gator DeLoach says this could have ended differently had the homeowner not been armed.
And she wasn't alone in the residence. She also had her 90-year-old mother, who's an Alzheimer's patient, in the home with her. So had she not had the foresight to arm herself, there's a high probability we may be investigating a double homicide right now where Best would have been the suspect.
An autopsy will be performed on Best to see if he was under the influence of any narcotics when he was shot. Of course, I'm going to have more on this story later tonight, including the 911 calls that Best had made to authorities. Also, one other note, this just coming in within the last couple of minutes. We have, because we haven't been out here too long, but we have spoken to quite a few of the neighbors all up and down this strip here. They are all saddened by this, some in tears, because they say they have known this man for more than 20 years, and they say what he is accused of is out of character. Again, we're going to have more on that coming up later tonight at 10 and 11.
And by the way, you can't see the neighborhood. This is kind of a dirt road, rural area, trees,
Mhm.
mobile homes. This is not, one house next to it. This is a very, very rural area. Remember last week we talked about 16 minutes police response time in New York
Yeah,
City?
that's crazy.
I'm guessing,
So much can happen in 16 minutes.
yeah, I don't think it's 16 minutes, but I bet you at least 5 to 10. So a guy breaks, you're 67
Yeah.
years old, your 90-year-old mother with Alzheimer's in the next room. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. What are you going to say to the guy? Hey, can you just
Yeah.
hold off a minute while I call 911 and get the
Yeah.
operator on the phone? No. So again, you're the person who's primarily responsible for your own safety.
Mhm.
So any thoughts on this 67-year-old woman?
Yeah, no, good for her for defending herself.
Yep. All right. Anything you want to add before we sign off today?
Yeah,
Let me see.
what were your thoughts on the Super Bowl?
Well, you probably know this. I placed a bet the second week of September on the Kansas City Chiefs to win the game. I actually put a $20 bet on the Kansas City Chiefs and a $20 bet on the Philadelphia Eagles. $20 in each. So obviously, the Eagles fell by the wayside, but I won $180 on my $20 bet. So I was happy. Exciting game, overtime. I was, I'm normally sound asleep before 10, so it was a struggle for me to stay awake, but it was a. How about you? How about your thoughts? Did you enjoy the game?
Yeah, I got to give so there was 3 Penn Staters in the game. Props to Donovan Smith, who he was offensive line for the Chiefs, so he got his second ring.
Mm-hmm.
But I got to give props. There was 2 Penn Staters on the 49ers, and Jar Brown, who's a safety. The beginning of the third quarter, man, he had an amazing play and just amazing play. So
Yeah.
sorry they lost, but good play.
Yeah.
Any standout commercials?
I love the Christopher Walken commercial. By the way, I know
I'm not a fan of Christopher Walken, but that was a good commercial.
It's a good commercial. So anyway,
And I was excited to see the return of the Clydesdales, Budweiser Clydesdales, but didn't have quite the emotional connection they normally do. But I'm glad they're back.
All right. So am I. Anyway, before we run out of time, let me wrap up here. Anyway, I want to thank everybody who listened to the podcast for once again giving up 30 minutes out of your busy day to listen to me ramble on about things I find of interest and importance. And I hope you found those topics as interesting and important as I did. And if so, I hope you continue to listen to podcasts in the weeks and months to come. If you want to see some of the materials and story links you heard me talk about today, you can find them on the Jerzee Joe website. And as soon as producer Susan puts them up there, and that's JER as in Robert, Z as in zebra, EE, JerzeeJoe.com. Just remember to spell Jerzee Joe with an R, a Z, and 2 E's. And if you want to email me, just send me an email to joe@jerzeejoe.com. And other than that, unless you got anything else to add, producer Susan, I will talk to you next week.
All right.
All right, talk to you then. All right, bye-bye. Thanks.